Ryan, what's on your radar?
So on Monday, a Democratic strategist hosted 3 focus groups with women in Virginia who voted in 2017 for Democrat Ralph Northam, in 2020 for Democrat Joe Biden, and then last week cast their ballot for Republican Glenn Youngkin. I spoke to him afterwards to ask about the methodology because when he posted some of the results on social media, there were a lot of skeptics coming at him about the way he was presenting the information. To me, it's a good thing when consultants post as much of the information super wealthy people are paying them to collect so that we can all have access to it and debate it, so I'm glad he did it. The strategist, Danny Barefoot, told me that his firm called roughly 30,000 people in Virginia. Most didn't answer, but several hundred of them fit the criteria he was looking for, having voted Dem, Republican in the last 3 elections. Those people were called back and offered a $100 gift card if they'd do a lunch hour Zoom and talk about why they voted the way they did. 96 of them were broken into 3 different sessions, and Danny sat in on one of them and got permission from the funders to share quotes and results. Focus groups, we should be clear, are different than surveys, which try to weight their responses to accurately reflect the population at large. And 96 respondents isn't generally considered enough for a robust polling sample, but that's not what this is. It's a chance to dig deeper into the views of a slice of the electorate that you care about. Half the group was from Northern Virginia, which is basically the D.C. suburbs. 1/5 were from Hampton Roads, 15% from Richmond, and 15% spread around the Commonwealth. Virginia is about 2/3 white, and this sample was 79% white, so slightly whiter than the state at large, but not by a ton. 11% of them were black women, 6% Latina, and 4% Asian American. As I talked to Barefoot about his results, I thought about a memo that was written after the Virginia election by another Democratic strategist, Andrew Levison, making the argument that Democrats aren't just lacking the answer to their problem with white voters without a college degree, which has become shorthand in political circles for white working class. Their problem is they're asking the entirely wrong question. The question should not be, he argues, how can Democrats convince the white working class to vote Democratic? Rather, it should be, how can Democrats identify a distinct, persuadable sector of the white working class and then convince members of that specific group to vote Democratic? Levison argues that the data consistently shows that Democrats solidly win about 1/3 of white working class voters, though that number is falling. They also lose about 1/3 right out of the gate. Those are hardcore right-wing people who would never consider voting for a Democrat and think even Chuck Schumer is a socialist and a traitor. A growing number of those people also think he's a cannibal. In other words, they're not persuadable. Levison calls that 1/3 extremist and distinguished themselves from the final third, which he calls cultural traditionalists. These are people who don't follow the news closely but have an easygoing personality and generally an open mind. When it comes to race, these traditionalists have something of a Michael Scott view, rooted in the cliche that they, quote, don't see race or don't see color. They also have personal, religious, and moral values they'd happily describe as, quote, old-fashioned, but say they have no problem with people who have different views. A genuine live and let live philosophy. They believe in patriotism and the American way of life, but also believe that diversity, pluralism, and tolerance are essential characteristics of that American way of life. They think of government and politicians as basically corrupt and bought off and often inefficient, but they don't think it's inherently evil, and they can be convinced that government can do good things. They think Democrats are a party that, quote, primarily represents social groups like educated liberals and racial or ethnic minorities while having little interest, understanding, or concern for ordinary white working people like themselves. What's interesting about Levison's distinction between these cultural traditionalists and what he calls the extremists is that except for that last part, all of it can apply to many, many black or Hispanic working class people as well. And even on that last part, that Democrats don't have much interest or concern for ordinary white working people, that's not really a value judgment, just a statement of fact, or at minimum, it's a statement of that voter's opinion based on Democratic messaging. I mean, think back to Hillary Clinton's rallies, for instance, where she'd single out every identity group that she promised that she would fight for. At some point, when the list gets really, really long and specific, and you're not listed on it, you notice. That doesn't mean you hold it against the people who did make the list, but you do notice. So back to the focus group. Danny said he didn't ask about college education because what he was interested in was people who lived in the suburbs regardless of race or educational background. What he and Levison found rhymed in some interesting ways. When asked if Democrats share their cultural values, one woman said, quote, "They fight for the right things and I usually vote for them, but they believe some crazy things. Sometimes I feel like if I don't know the right words for things, they think I'm a bigot." When asked which party had better policy proposals, the group overwhelmingly said Democrats. But when asked which group had cultural values closer to theirs, they cited Republicans. It would be tempting to conclude right there that, well, these are just a bunch of bigots. No point even talking to them. But remember that a fifth of them are non-white, and all of them voted Democratic in the last 2 elections. Something else is going on. Danny found that school closures were a big part of it. And as I argued last week, school closures and the CRT debate, critical race theory debate, are mingled in people's minds. One Latina woman put it perfectly, talking about how remote school foisted so much work on parents, yet now McAuliffe didn't want their input anymore. She said, "They asked us to do all this work for months, and then he says it's none of our business." Another woman from Fairfax said, quote, "They would keep schools closed forever if they could. They'd keep our kids online until the 7th booster." Half of the women said they supported school closures, but they were closed for too long. And 35% said they shouldn't have been closed at all. Again, this isn't a precise survey, but 86% of these women disagreeing with Democratic school closure policies suggests the anger was indeed widespread, even if it wasn't that high of a number. Yet other than schools, 63% of them said that the state's COVID policies were just about right. In other words, these were not people showing up at anti-lockdown protests or anti-mask protests or anti-vax protests. They just really, really hated the school closures. The women's comments on critical race theory were interesting too. A broad majority had an unfavorable view of it. Some said it meant teaching the worst aspects of our history, while another put it this way: CRT may not be included in the school curriculum, but some of the worst ideas from it are slipping into our schools. One black woman put it this way, quote, "Our kids should be taught about slavery and all of that awfulness, but America is also a good country, and that's what I want my kids to learn," unquote. But CRT didn't specifically seem to play a huge role in their voting, since only 1/4 of them said it was being taught in Virginia schools, while half were unsure and another quarter said that it wasn't. At the end, they were asked if they'd have considered changing their vote if Democrats had passed their bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is something that Virginia Senator Mark Warner had been saying would have helped. 91% said no, and 9% said yes, and one woman laughed and said, "What does that have to do with anything?" And she's right to laugh, but that 9% number actually points to something hopeful for Democrats. In a close race, a swing like that can matter. If they'd have also passed the reconciliation bill and could talk about universal pre-K, the child tax credit, clean energy investments, subsidies for child care, you could potentially have won even more of them back. The problem of Democrats being out of touch culturally, though, would still have to be overcome. As the women said, they agree with Democrats on policy. They just don't connect with them. The reaction to the Virginia loss from Democrats, which has been to call all the Youngkin voters racist, only reinforces that disconnect. What Democrats need most is some humility. They need to listen from a place without judgment and try to hear them as people. So if that's the problem, what's the solution for Democrats?
It's a big problem because people vote for who they like, and then they eventually contort themselves to end up agreeing with whatever the views are of the person they've already decided they liked. You know, you and I, people who are really policy focused, people in D.C., media people, political wonks, we're all like, well, this is, this person has the right combination of policies that matter to me. Most people are not intensely focused on politics that way. Something more like entertainment or sports for them, or something that really there's one narrow part of it that, like the schools, that really affects their life, and that's the thing they're going to focus, and they're not going to look at everything else. Democrats need to stop talking about Trump. They need to stop, unless he actually runs. That will be a major gift to them. They need to address these issues. I mean, these people in Danny Barefoot's focus group, They got it exactly. I mean, they reflect my views pretty closely on these issues. What they thought about schools and about critical race theory was really accurate. They're like, yeah, well, maybe it's not exactly critical race theory, but there is some stuff we don't like that we've seen in here that we're bothered by, and we don't like that the schools are suddenly saying we should have no control over this when it was left to us for 2 years, which is very reasonable, and you can understand why they would take that out on Democrats.
And the point about having to run somebody that is likable, that connects with voters is key. And actually, Jacobin, the socialist magazine, has a massive new survey out today, which was previewed in the New York Times. We can put some of that up, some of the results from that up here. Basically, so they asked two different questions. One, I mean, they've asked a bunch of different questions, but two really important ones were, so one was, who do you like? And if you were the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, that was the worst. That was worse. And Glenn Youngkin was the head of Carlyle Group. So, what an epic fail on the part of Democrats that they couldn't take this completely unlikable profession and translate that into a negative.
But what's Terry McAuliffe's career politician is probably doesn't even rank on that. It was so low.
And investor in Carlyle. So that was why they couldn't do that. The top performing job, interestingly, was small business owner. People across the board, cross race, cross politics, cross everything, liked small business owners. They also liked construction work. Well, actually, construction work was right around neutral. Everything else was negative. Veteran. People liked veteran as well. Then when it came to messaging, what kind of messaging they liked, this was also interesting. You can put that one up. So populist progressive, which was appealing universally to all people against the elites. That was the number one. Number two was Republican, which is similar to that, but it attacks all Democrats as socialists. So both of those are pretty popular. But then the worst, the people that they hated the most, they woke moderate, using a lot of identity language, but then also only calling for bland things like we need to talk to the experts and do the best we can for you. And then woke
we need to get you a copy of Robin DiAngelo's book. That's our solution.
And woke progressive doing only slightly better than that. So I think all of this stuff fits together. People don't connect with the quote unquote woke language, and they don't connect with elite business owners, and they feel like there's a gap between themselves and who Democrats are. And if Democrats don't manage to connect between those two things, then they're lost. And I think the only way they can do it is with better candidates who have actual connections to working class people who understand them. And I think that Joe Biden, even though he'd been in the Senate since 1972, has managed to very consciously has held on to his lunch pail Joe image, his middle class Joe.
Absolutely, Joe Biden's the best the party has. I mean, they do not have a very deep, at the presidential level, certainly bench. Kamala Harris is, I think we're going to talk about that later, is really unpopular. There's not a lot. And Mayor Pete, Elizabeth Warren, these are people who just don't Joe Biden trounced them, and you could imagine someone doing a lot better than Joe Biden, but there just isn't anyone in the lineup.
Right, and that Jacobin polling shows that a Pete Buttigieg type of candidate who is a woke moderate, and with an elite background. He's veteran, but everybody thinks he became a veteran just so he could get into politics. That type of profile of a candidate is the last thing that voters want. It checks all of the absolute wrong boxes. Anyway, looking forward to what's on your radar.